Coding, nice, yes. Coding can definitely keep you sane or make you feel insane. Yoga's a must, Jason Jones. Monticello.
Look at Marcella going, dang.
Wow, Python, C++, French, Klingon, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. There to the max, I love it. Wow, Python plus C++, that's an interesting combo. Meditation at the 10% happier app. Ooh, nice. I've never used that. I use Headspace. Calculus. Ooh, whoa. Yoga's a must, calculus. Yeah, calculus is beautiful.
So says you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it can be explained in a way that's not so great, but I think when well explained, it's pretty beautiful.
All right. I won't trust you.
I was thinking about last time I was cutting a mango. I was like, wow, I'm wasting some of the flesh because the mango skin is curved. But if I cut smaller and smaller pieces, eventually I would waste none of the flesh because I'd be like, there'd be no curve. And that's basically the essence of calculus. Smaller and smaller curves. I do Pluralsight courses. My favorite star is Deborah Karuda. Oh, wow. I've never used Pluralsight. Have you, April?
Yeah, I have. I've taken some things on there. What does Deborah teach, Lydia? Like, is there a specific language?
She's all about Angular.
Okay, cool.
Angular, wow. You have to teach me. I learned Angular in school a while back. That was like 3 years ago, and now that was Angular. That was the first version of Angular. So maybe you should give a talk, Lydia. Get me up to speed.
Plus from here. Lydia should give a talk.
Yeah, I have a kid here right by me, so I can have a lot of my turned off. I'm doing the mute just to make sure that it's not gonna be that loud.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's good. Get your kids around. That's great. But your kids will need to leave you alone when you give your talk in a few weeks, Lydia. Yay, calculus is good. Let's see. Make sure I got the slides pulled up so we're ready to go. I'm gonna put the prompt. Are you doing this? For anyone who's new, that's what we're talking about. Nice. Greg used Headspace too. Just reviewing some stuff. It's lots of plants in your background, David. Oh, yeah. See, I can actually see myself right now. Let me see if I can flip. Oh, yeah. So my fiance is a huge plant person. I will give you a little tour. You can see back here, we actually like a little series of plants. There's a fountain that's turned off right now, but in between. And then I think these are just sort of like plant-like spikes that are sort of trying to mask the Wi-Fi router thingy to make it look a little nicer. So it's all hidden inside those boxes. Yeah. Felipe, are you a plant person? Are you a frequenter of, I don't know, I'm from Riverside, so I go to Peep a lot. P-I-E-P is a plant store downtown Riverside. But I definitely know my fiance definitely buys plants to stay sane. So look here, it's up there. I live in the desert, no plants, LOL. Oh my gosh, okay. It's true. Yeah, Riverside is kind of deserty, but yeah, we keep them inside.
Every time I think I got this, and then I'll get like the self-watering pot, like, and then it's still so freaking hot here that I still have to water it all the time, and then it just dies. Too many things going on. I'm like,
gosh,
sorry,
yeah.
plant, I tried.
Nice. Okay, people still rolling in. I'm just gonna wait, I guess, a few more minutes before we jump in. Make sure I get the slides. Cool. So April, just to kick off, maybe I'll share this. I'll share the slides, and then you wanna kick us off? Great. Yes. Let me get those ready. Cool. I'm gonna share my screen now. Give April a view of, give everyone a view of what's going on. So here are slides. You can cheat ahead. Cool. And even before we jump in, I think one thing I wanted to say, April, maybe you could add it to this, is just like, I think what's amazing about Inland Empire software developers as a community is that we are all in different places in the journey, and we're all just learning and committed to learning. And so we're giving this talk because we are learning, and these are things that we've struggled with, and we want other people to A, know that they're not alone, and B, share their tips with us, and also just have more support and resources and do this together. Yeah. Yeah. So for sure. And so if you want to make a comment, unmute yourself, throw it out there. If you want to drop it in the chat, whoever's not talking, we'll try and monitor the chat. Yeah. And I think actually, so this is a little secret, don't tell anyone, but there may be a part 2 to this coming. This is still very much in the works, where we might be going a little bit more into detail, specifically into React, large React front-end code bases. But that's to come. So getting the part 1, maybe. Cool. So it's 3:10, and got a lot of amazing faces, many of which I know, some of which I don't know. And April, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So kind of one of the big impetuses for putting together this talk was just in regards to some of the conversations that I've had and things that I've noticed, and also from my own experience, which is that when I first started looking at doing open source contributing, in addition to just GitHub being super huge, I would open up Codebases, and they just seemed way too overwhelming for me to even like fathom that I knew where to begin. So it took the impetus of going through the Outreachy program, where if I wanted to succeed, I was gonna have to dig in. Like there really wasn't an option. So at that point, I started coming up with, what kind of strategies and things to put into place in order to take some of the overwhelm away and be able to jump in and start making changes within the code. Okay, go ahead, next.
Sorry, I'm struggling over here with my keyboard. Okay, cool. This is slide 1, and I'm now going to click and advance the slide.
All right.
Boom, there we go. And I also want to say, side note, I don't think April mentioned this, but this talk, she'll be talking about some of her open source work, but actually she recently started working on a large front-end code base, and she can mention more about that. But we got a budding professional on our hands.
Yeah, keyword is budding. I'm 2 months into my first front-end developer job. So at 1Password.
Nice.
And it's been a really great experience overall. And, one of the things that I shared with David was, even after coming in from my Mozilla internship, where I spent 5 months kind of learning how to navigate through the code base, jumping into a brand new code base, and I had to start over more than I thought I would. And that was a little surprising. But it definitely didn't take as long to get acclimated and to be able to utilize the tools that I had learned previously to kind of get rolling. So I'm feeling a lot more confident within their code base and starting to, branch out and make bigger contributions, which feels really good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and one of the reasons that we decided to go ahead and we're going to utilize one of the tasks that I took on when I was doing my Mozilla internship. And part of that is just to really ground this in the actual real life experience, what it looks like to see that big code, and then how to get started. So with Pontoon, their main mission is to make the internet more accessible as a company, but then Pontoon's contribution to that is providing a way for their Firefox projects, any kind of documentation, et cetera, to be translated. So the browser itself, as well as anything else associated with it, is processed and crowdsourced, translated through the Pontoon system or the application. They're overwhelmed. We already talked about that. It's a lot of code. But one of the things that you can really kind of look at is the fact that, you know, the code bases are typically organized with the model controller view process in mind. So if you can kind of keep that vision, then you can just kind of look at what task you're working on and then ask yourself, like, in what area would this code belong? And it helps you just kind of narrow things down a little bit that way. So then we're also going to go into opening up the application, and I'm going to show you some practical ways that I use to help find myself, to get myself around a code base.
Great. Love it. Can't wait to get practical. Cool. And so, yeah, I think we kind of covered this. Do you want to just quickly go over this, April, actually?
You can, yeah, go ahead and jump.
Sure, yeah. So as you might have guessed, we want to take you away is a way of, on a high level, understanding the different pieces of model, view, and controller of a code base, how they connect imperfectly, sometimes very much in a modular, sometimes very much overlapping. We want you to know that you just need to find a place to start when you're feeling overwhelmed. And you can make the small changes, and that'll get you on your way. And also the fact that there are resources out there. You know, we're here to support. Googling things is tremendously helpful. Mentors can kind of like totally clear up stuff. And then also a whole bunch of practical tips that April's going to get into at the end of the talk. So great, back to you, April.
So the issue that we're going to address was in regards to the Pontoon app. And so again, it's a crowdsourced translation of Mozilla's projects into people's local languages. And the app was originally set up, it assumed that you would translate from English. And there were people who wanted to be able to translate from another language. So for example, maybe English is their fourth language that they speak. So translating from English to their native language is actually a triple jump. So they wanted the ability to have the strings be available to them in, say, a language that was a little closer to them before they made the translations. And so that was the task that I was assigned to do.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can share, April.
Perfect.
Great. Yeah, and I want to just emphasize, so this is a project, April, you kind of jumped into. You've done some coding, you've done some learning. This was sort of your first big open source contribution, right?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
I had just previously to this, I did do a couple of smaller contributions to the Mozilla central code base. And that, with Joanne's help, I was able to get their central code onto my computer. And then I found a couple of what they call good first bugs. And they were pretty straightforward and not really too involved in regards to, it was like one line changes here, or like just small little things. Yeah. And in those cases, the mentors actually would often give a link directly to the area of the code that you needed to be in, because they knew they were first bugs. And so they gave you kind of a roadmap to get there. So it wasn't until Mozilla or to the Pontoon that I actually had to find my own way.
Okay, wow. Amazing. So what is Pontoon? Show us this app as it's finished.
So this is the homepage of Pontoon, and again, it's just a localization app. And these pages here are built through just traditional means, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, on this aspects of like the teams, the different projects. And this is their main website. So while I'm not logged in, so I don't have an account on this one, you can see there's quite a few projects and teams that are represented in here. And then once you are working on an actual project, you go into the actual app. And this section here is a React app. And this is where the actual translations occur. So over here, you have the strings. And as you can see, they're coming in English. You can see underneath it if it's already had at least one approved translation that shows. If you wanted to suggest a different translation or make an adjustment to it, you would do that into the editor here. And then there's sources and resources over here for you as well, terminology for, say, the definition of attendee. So then you kind of know, oh, okay, I know what that means. Now I can translate it into my language a little more cleanly. And then they also show you the different locales that have already translated this. So again, if you have 3 or 4 languages under your belt, maybe you want to look at your Czech translation, and that's going to be a little closer for you to get an idea of how you might translate a word that maybe isn't as common in your language. So that's the basic structure of the app.
Nice. And if I'm hearing you right, April, like when I'm looking at this thing, I'm reading below copy link, I'm seeing maker party attendee survey. So that's like the English word that we want translated. But maybe I don't speak English super well. So that like there's an option to have that in a different language?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
Well, there is now.
Oh, there is now? What? Who did that?
That would be me.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay, how did you do it? Like, keep going, sorry.
No, that's okay. So that's just a quick overview of kind of what Pontoon is and how it works at its full level. So what I want to show you though is the actual code base. So when you look at it initially, you think to yourself, it's not so bad. I mean, it's a few files there. But then you start looking even more and you're like, okay, you know, your bin files, your Docker files, docs, etc. So again, a lot of those files are files that you're probably not going to touch unless you're directly involved on a deeper level of the project. So the key files for Pontoon is this front end file. That's where the React code is all.
That seems intuitive.
And then the actual Pontoon file, Pontoon file. And this is where the backend is. And for Pontoon, their backend is based in Django. So it also has the HTML in it for those pages that aren't in React. So like the home page and so forth. And so once you start getting in here, you say, okay, now we've got more files that we're looking at. And while they still seem somewhat condensed, like for example, this base, you're thinking, oh, okay, so that's not too many files, until you go in and you open this models py file and you realize it has nearly 3,600 lines of code. And that's just one file. And then even here on the front end, all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, let me check out the source files. And you get in here, you've got core files, then you've got module files. And just in the module files, like this one alone, go to the components, and just entity details has quite a few files. And you know, some of the other items that are equally as profuse are like your history panel, and your machinery has quite a bit in it as well. So it becomes really overwhelming really quickly once you start opening up these files and breaking them down and finding, you know, the end of the line.
Yeah, and so this is where you just sort of give up and realize that this is for a better coder to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is, I probably, as soon as I started opening maybe even just this file, I would have been like, oh, wow, I don't even know what those are.
Yeah, I've been there so often myself. Amazing.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it back over to David, and he is going to talk to you guys about the higher level concepts of that.
Right, so at this point, April, I'm looking at this code base with you, and I'm like high level confused, like for real. So let me share my desktop. Okay, you can see, cool. Let me go back to this. Can you guys see the slides right now?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so you kind of shared the Pontoon demo, then you went to the code base, and like, I just want to cry. There's like so much going on. If I had built this code base, maybe I'd know where to start, but I really don't know where to start. And so what I want to do today is kind of talk about, on a high level, how can we think about the different parts of a code base and really get our bearings? And then April get practical, but I'm going to get high level because that's what I like to do. High level talking, smocking. April actually has the job in the big code base, so she does the actual work. And you'll see here that we've got this little telescope pointed out into a constellation of like little code pieces and bits. And within that constellation, you could just make out a model, a controller, and a view. And I want you to think about this analogy of overlapping, intermixing things, but a structure and a constellation within it. So not perfect division, but something that unifies it. Okay, so the hidden constellations and how these big apps connect. Okay, so to understand this complicated app that's a pretty modern app in terms of the last few years, Pontoon, I want to actually take us back to way back into the 90s when the web first started. It started as a place basically, Sir Tim Berners-Lee had this idea while working at CERN that he wanted to share scientific papers. Let people edit them and of course share cat pics because that was one of the biggest aims of the internet. And so what he did is basically he had a server or a basic computer, and on that there was a single file, index.html. And in that file, there was some UI, right? There was an h1 tag, like a header, maybe some buttons, maybe some more text. There was some data, right? Like maybe outlined the table, maybe had some cat photos in that table. And there was a little, like some JavaScript, or I guess this came later, but there was some basic logic to how the app would work as it progressed. Again, this is a simplification. Those of you who know web history know that this isn't fully true, but it's a good sort of approximation. And that server, that computer that Tim Berners-Lee had, would basically then transfer this little one document to the browser. The browser would show it, someone would use it, and then someone could maybe submit a form and send some data back to edit this one document, and this document would change for everyone. So it's kind of like Wikipedia with no controls. You just directly edit the document. And that's why you only needed one document. But the web, as we know it, is not like this today. And so things got really cray-cray, as you know. And so basically, to deal with the fact that we wanted to have tons of data, multiple accounts, users, we broke things up into smaller pieces. And those two pieces are the data. So for example, who are the users? What translations have existed? Who's commented on the translation? The logic, so basically being like, which translations should I show? What do I do when someone submits a form? How do I store that into the database? And the logic is talking both to the database, but also to the UI. And so from that data, we then, on the back end, generate a UI, we put together some HTML, and we send that to the browser and show that. This is sort of the first way we started to build really big, complicated apps, was by basically having a server that sort of could be maintained with a big database, logic that could translate the data into a UI, and a UI then that got sent to a browser, and the browser sent back some information from the UI that we then did some logic on to store as data. But if you have done much modern web development, you might realize that you may have never actually built a server. You've only worked on the front end, and you're like saying, well, what about JavaScript? What about all this stuff that I do on the front end? And that's true, because actually the way we build apps has changed. But before I jump into what's changed about building apps, I kind of want to step back and say, why did we kind of choose this idea of splitting things into data, into logic, and into UI? And the truth is, this isn't some complicated, arbitrary programmer speak. This is actually a very natural phenomenon. So here I have some examples of things that are actually very similar to this idea of a data, logic, and UI. So starting here on the left, our brain is kind of like a database. It has a whole bunch of knowledge that's related. And we ultimately talk, speak, and write. This is sort of the user interface, or the human interface that we show other people. But between that, we need to translate. We need to basically respond to questions. We need to form sentences and do logic. So this is sort of this controller or translator view that happens in the middle. This is kind of our database, and this is our user interface or human interface. And this pattern holds true across a lot of things. So chefs have sort of a database of raw ingredients. They want to make a sort of a human-friendly meal, and they access a whole bunch of logic and steps to get between the two. And maybe if someone doesn't like the meal, they might say, hey, I don't like this thing. And it might actually be submitted backwards into the chef's sort of ingredients. He might drop some ingredients and change that and change what he stores. So it's a two-way data flow. And then finally, you can think about a very common user interface is an oven, right? A stove. It's got these knobs that turn, that activate a lighter, that turn up the temperature, that set a timer. And that's the interface we're used to seeing. But actually, behind the scenes, there's a whole bunch of logic. There's pipes, valves, attenuators, connectors, wires, electricity that sort of draw from these natural sort of databases store of materials, gas, flame, electricity, and translate that into something that's human usable. Again, these metaphors are not perfect. There's definitely flaws. For example, a database, gas is not exactly like data. But I just want to get to this idea of having a model or a database, having a controller or a logic in between them, and having a human interface is really found everywhere. And so even if you're new to coding, you actually understand this concept pretty well. So jumping on to the next slide, we sort of, as the internet developed, browsers got way faster, and we wanted more complex, highly interactive web pages. You can think about like Facebook. We want to be able to type something, submit a comment, have it update instantly, instead of having to reload the page. And if you go back to the old school thing, anytime I made a change to the browser, I'd often have to submit that logic to the back end, them send me a new web page, and totally refresh the page. And this just doesn't work. It's slow, and it sort of breaks up the user experience. And so we had this new model of building web pages where we actually shifted a lot of the work to the browser. And so when we talk about big front-end code bases, or just code bases in general, a lot of what we're seeing nowadays is more on the front end. When you think about a React app, for example, React is generating the user interface. It's also handling some of the logic of what to render, how to render it, how to fetch data from the database. And there's a server which has a little bit of logic in terms of endpoints and things. But it's basically mostly we're just pulling data from the database. So the browser really became the cool half of the island where a lot of the magic is happening. But it also made front-end applications really complicated, really big. And before we get to some practical stuff, it's helpful to kind of understand the evolution of this and also understand each of these pieces. And before we get to the practical stuff from April, I just kind of want to go ahead and talk about sort of the official language that's used around this. So officially, when we talk about a database, we have sort of like a list of users or that have a list of like translations they've submitted or some preferences on that user. That's like the database. We call it the model. This is the model of how the information relates. And as I've referenced earlier, we ultimately translate that to the view or the user interface that we display. And in between, we have a controller who handles that logic. And so you'll often hear the term MVC, which stands for Model View Controller, to describe this pattern. This is actually a pretty terrible acronym because not only are all these terms kind of confusing, it's actually Model Controller View because this is sort of the flow of information. It's not Model View, then Controller. But that's sort of a term you might hear a lot, MVC. People will talk about that as a framework for developing apps. And before I go any further, I want you to notice that this is a kind of a hip gradient fade. And that's not because I love graphic design and I want it to look cool. It's because I wanted you to understand that there's kind of a porous interface between all three of these. Rarely will you ever, except in really old apps, see a strict segregation between the database, the controller, and the view, which you'll actually see as sort of them all blended together. I'm going to give you a quick example of this. This is a little bit messy. This is actually a real app that I built for work. And so I'm going to just zoom in here really fast. So here's React. If you don't know React super well, I wouldn't worry too much. I just kind of want to get the gist across. But this is a view. So this is a file called navbar.js. And as you can see, it's a basic function. This function here takes in whether to hide the navbar, whether to show the start screen, the current scene index, and it returns a whole bunch of HTML. And that's a view, right? It's basically saying this is what the user is going to see. And it has no logic in it. But if you look at some more complex apps, so that's React. This is React being very viewish. When we talk about controllers, you can see here, here's another part of the application that I built. And this is a pretty big React component. It's got a lot of moving pieces. This is all just the view here that's being returned and rendered to the canvas. But you'll actually notice that I've got some logic here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And don't worry too much about the details. But in this case, I'm saying if the raw story map is null or the map style is null, I just want you to return null. So I want you to render something different. I want you just to render nothing. And so this is actually logic. This is what we call a piece of the controller. And so as you can see, we have these concepts, but they're kind of mixed together. And you can see up here, I've got some more logic. So sort of like I'm handling when someone presses the left arrow key or the right arrow key to kind of move through different slides. And this is definitely has nothing to do with displaying content to the user. It has everything to do with handling user inputs and handling logic. And so the last thing I want to say is, even though this is a purely front-end code base, we do have to deal with the model a lot. And what you'll see is in this case, I'm using a framework called Redux, which basically has all these complicated functions, or semi-complicated functions that basically load, in this case, Mapbox styles from databases into our app. And so you're saying, and so what you're seeing here is that I basically separated things that have to do with more with controlling and also the database into other parts of my app. And what this allows me to do is to ultimately build really, really, really complicated apps. And so if I were to go to this actual app as it's deployed right now, what you can see is there's a ton of stuff happening on it. There's this start screen is loading, there's a map loading in the background, but all of this stuff is really, really complicated. So it would never really be possible unless I had a clear separation between different parts of my app. And so here you're seeing basically a lot of logic. Right now I'm fetching data from the back end. Fetching data would be fetching from like the database or the model. And once I fetch that data, you can see that I'm actually going ahead and displaying on the front end using the UI. So a lot of complexity going on in these apps. This is why it's necessary to break them up into tiny pieces. And so if you can recognize this underlying structure and be like, oh, hey, I'm looking at this. This is some text here. This is part of the view. I'm going to look for where this exists in the code base. Or you're saying, oh, whoa, some data was fetched. There must be some connection to the model where it's being visualized here. Or you can say, oh, hey, look at this. There's some interaction and logic happening here. When I click this exit button, it closes that data visualization. When I click this, it opens it. That must be happening as part of the controller. And while these all might be mixed up to some degree, it's helpful to think about them as three sort of key flavors of what you do on a front-end code base. So having said that, I want to sort of get us thinking a little bit more about what we're going to do with April. So April is going to make some changes to the models. She's going to update the controllers and the view. And I asked her like, while we were working on this, where did your time really go? And so she spent a lot of time in the logic of her app, and you'll understand why later. A little bit of time updating sort of what was in the database. She needed to add some new fields, and a significant amount of time updating the view because she was adding basically a new option, a new dropdown to the app. And so just kind of in conclusion, I want you to know that model, view, and controller are all parts and ways of thinking about an app, but it's never quite so cut and dry. But with this in mind, it'll give you at least a little bit of clarity to start with something that's totally new and totally unfamiliar. So now we want to get to the application and some actual code, and I will pass the reins back to April.
All right.
Let me go ahead and stop my share. Also, if there are any questions or thoughts, or like maybe you have a better way of saying things, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to incorporate them.
I was just going to say, while I'm loading this up, if anybody has a question, go ahead and submit that in there before we jump to the next step. So this was the issue that I was working on and that we chose because it did touch all aspects of that model, with the model and then into the controller and onto the view. So essentially we were adding the ability to use a localization as an alternative source language for translation. And so when you get an issue like this, it's really important to read through the title for one, but then you can look at the reporter. So the original reporter said, here's what the application doesn't have, or the thing that's going wrong, or whatever piece of information that they felt they needed to share in order to have their issue or their bug addressed. And then you can see here there was some debate on whether or not this was a repeat bug from somewhere else. And they clarified to say, nope, it's completely distinct. Please don't disregard.
Sure.
And so when you read through all of that, you get a good sense of a lot of things, and it depends on the issue. Sometimes it's just a back and forth and whatever, but there's usually nuggets of information in there that are valuable and worthwhile. So for this particular issue, it broke it all the way down as they went through and they answered questions and they got clarity and they decided, okay, yes, this is an issue that we should probably address and we move forward with. At which point, Matt Jess, who's was one of my mentors, went ahead and created a mock-up of what he wanted to see visually for this particular feature, as well as broke it down into 3 main steps. And
Nice.
For this particular one, the reason he did that was because I was interning and it was a mentored bug. So, he made it a point to kind of put a little bit of a roadmap in there for me. But at any point, this would be something that would absolutely be worth asking for. If you've looked at this issue and you're like, I'm not sure where to start, then start would be to say, okay, I understand the issue is this. Can you please let me know where you think a good place to begin would be? And oftentimes, somebody will respond back to say, why don't you go ahead and start here, or not. But typically, especially when you're dealing with like a company like Mozilla that really supports contributions, you're most likely going to get a really friendly response.
Awesome.
So in this case, step number 1 was spelled out for me, which was to go into the model for the user profile and add an additional field called preferred source locale. And in this case, he actually gave me a link directly to not only the code, but also the actual line number. I'm not going to click that now because that's no longer the line number. I know for a fact that I moved that piece of code because I had a dependency that was above that I needed, or below that I needed it to be above in order to access. But it was nice to start with because I was able to jump directly to the actual user profile and take a look at it immediately. So that was nice. But then I had to move on to step number 2. Step number 2 was to add a setting so that the user could choose what their preferred source locale would be and wanted it to be on the settings page. So I was still fairly new to the app at this point, and I don't even know if I knew how to get to the settings.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
If I'm being perfectly honest.
Yeah.
But either way, so this is where when you open up, you can see, okay, so this is what the UI is supposed to look like. And in this case, you've got your select your home page, personal information, and here's the new piece right here. this preferred source locale. So the original design was to put it in the middle of the page. And so the things that I could take away from seeing this image was that this functionality was going to be very similar to this functionality.
Nice.
So I said, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to see how does this function, because that's probably going to be what I'm going to guide myself with. And so select your home page is a pretty unique phrase that I can probably find just by searching. So that's exactly what I did.
Nice. And you're using VS Code.
And I am using, yes. So
nice.
Just for clarity, yes, I will be using VS Code, but most IDEs will have tools that will help you. Select your, oh, here we go. So we've already got something coming up just from select your, and as you can see, when you hover over it, it is a label, select your homepage, and it's in the settings.html. So that matches with what he had stated in regards to it being on a settings page. So within just a few seconds, I'm already at the code that is the page that's rendering those selections. So now I can just start to break down, okay, so where do I go from here? It gets a little bit more complicated on this one. Again, this is in Django and it's using some templating. So one of the nice features of VS Code is that you can right click on stuff. You can hover over it and get information, but you can also right click and go to definitions, go to references, find all references, etc. But in the case of these selectors, if I do definition, it's going to say, I don't know what that is because it's in a template and I can't read it.
Sure. And can you clarify what is the definition exactly?
I'm sorry, what? A definition?
Yeah.
I'm going to show that a little bit later as we get deeper into the code.
Nice.
Yes. So for this one, I have a team_selector and it's going to search for locale. So where do I find that? If I look a little bit further, I realize that this particular file is importing this Teams widgets team selector as team selector. So, okay, so now I know that I need to go and find this. But when I'm looking at that code base, where is that?
Oh my gosh.
Again, we're back into, okay, now I have to try to either track that down. So in VS Code, if you do Command P, it opens a search that allows you to search files by name. And so since I now know that that one's called team_selectors, HTML, I can go directly to that file. And I'm going to see that in this file, the only thing that exists is the locale selector. So this is just kind of following the breadcrumbs of that homepage selector to get me where I need to be to just even kind of get started.
Nice. And April, so quick question. When you were like first looking at this, did you even understand everything that was happening in these pages?
Not entirely, no. Normally what would end up happening is I would stop on that page and I would read the code and just kind of get my bearings and make sure I was on the right page because, you know, sometimes the code that, or the phrase that you thought was unique actually exists in a couple of locations. And so you need to kind of read the structure around it to see, oh, okay, yeah, this is the page that I should be on. Which is the case here. I can see that we're creating an unordered list of list items, and those list items is having a locale name and a locale code, which is exactly what we saw on the front end. But where is this locales list and this locale selected coming from? That gets a little bit trickier. So we know that it was being passed in from this function here, or from this template. So it was passing in a locales and a locale. But one of the disadvantages to this code is that locales and locale are used a lot.
Oh no.
That's not going to help me. So then I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to homepage because that's still what we're dealing with is selecting this homepage. It's going to have some smaller options for me. And as I look in here, I start to see, okay, we've got use a custom form for a homepage. Let's see what that does. And we can see that this is using, and it's creating a custom homepage. So if I look at this and I say, okay, where is this being used? So it's a form that's responsible for saving the custom homepage, which is, you can see what the code comment was here. So that's a nice feature that VS Code will give you the comments. So if I right click on that and I go to the references, I can see where is this code being used. So it's being, I've got a couple of places here in the forms file that I'm already in, but it's also being used in the views.py. And I can see here that it's something is equaling this. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and check that out. And sure enough, I'm here where I'm saving the custom homepage. So I can double click on this and it's going to open that file. So now I'm in views.py and I'm looking at the save custom homepage. And again, this is just telling me now that we're saving the file, the form, basically. So now we've got saved data. So what do I do with that? Okay, so now, okay, this custom underscore homepage, let's see if that exists somewhere else on this here. I'm going to highlight that and then do a Command F to find all of the locations where that is. So we've got your save custom homepage or here, and then that's 2, which is what we're looking at. So let's go ahead and go down and see where else it is. Okay, so now we know where we're setting it as a value, select our values here. And then, but that's still not getting us to where it's returned. So if we go through all of this, now we're seeing that we've got a return statement. And in this return statement, it's being returned as locale. And you can see above that was locales. So if you remember correctly from when we were in our settings HTML, those were the items that were being sent in order to create that list.
Nice.
So,
wow.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, one question we had in the audience, and I'm also wondering, this is like super helpful to walk through. When you first started out, how familiar were you with Django, and how did you get to being able to sort of see all these pieces connect?
I had never used Django. I had actually never used Python prior to this project.
Okay.
So a lot of this was just a lot of Googling.
Sure.
Whenever I would see a pattern or something I didn't recognize, for example, this curly brace with the %. Okay, so I was like, well, what is that? So I went out to Google and I put that in there, and that's when I realized that that was a Django template.
Nice.
So it definitely is a little bit of detective work, particularly when you first get started. And then so you had asked earlier what the definition is. So if I see this custom homepage locale, maybe I came across that first. If I right click and go to the definition, it's actually going to take me where that is set. So you can see this is where it's being given a value. And so now I know how it's being defined, where it's being defined. So you saw before where we were looking at how it was referenced. Now we're looking at where it's defined. And that will open up even if it's in a different file, much like that reference did. So that helps quite a bit as well. And then as you noticed, as we went through this, you probably noticed as you went, but that this preferred locales and preferred locale closely follow within the code base. So as we've got the custom homepage locale being defined here, we've got our preferred source locale being defined right underneath it. And the reason for that is because after doing all of that back work and research, I realized that all I needed to do was modify this custom homepage locale and change the source data so that it was the preferred source locales. So it's being saved in a different field and it's doing slight modifications to the default settings when it displays. But when you take that to the front end, you'll see that we changed the UI. And so we actually decided to put them side by side, or one on top of the other. And they both have the same functionality in regards to their lists. Setting your homepage and setting your locale. So that was me just kind of finding this commonality within the code that, and then finding a way to use that as my guidepost as I went through the code, and to then replicate it with this particular piece. And that's not always going to be the scenario, but you'll often find that there are things within the code base. So you need to add a button. Most well-built websites will have consistency to how their buttons are implemented and displayed. So you can often find a code somewhere within the code, a button that will look like the button you're trying to generate that you can utilize on that one. And then to see the full functionality of that, the next phase of that was to process the data. Ultimately, I originally thought that I would be processing the data on the front end. So this is a slightly older version because I'm on my branch and I haven't pulled the most latest master in because there's
Nice.
some conflicts with the code I'm working on. So you'll see there's only 3 columns here instead of the 4, and the terminology is not there. But other than that, it's the same app. So when I first started looking, I began the next trick that I'll often do if I don't have a distinct, so like these strings aren't going to help me because they're not distinct to this div, they're distinct as strings. So I needed to find something within this div that would connect me to the file where this is displayed. And the way that I do that is I inspect the element and I start looking for items that are unique to this particular thing. So like a class name or an ID. And in this case, it's this entity is unselectable. And if I was to go in the code base and search for that, I would then find this section of the code to be able to start researching and figuring out how my fixes are going to fit into this.
That makes sense. If I'm hearing you right, April, what you're saying is with some hard-coded pieces of text, they exist in the code base. So you can simply see them in the view, the rendered web page, copy and paste them, and you're set to go. But with a lot of other things, like the actual what's being displayed is being pulled from the database. So it's not actually in the code base itself. So in that sense, you're saying like a really great way to do it for a front-end developer is to go in and find something unique or indicative like a class. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, cool.
And I've even done it when I'm trying to locate where something is into the back end, which is I'll start with where it gets rendered on the front end. And then I'll find, okay, so this is where it's being used on the front end. And then I'll back trace the code. Okay, that code's being sent in from here, which is being sent in from here, which is being grabbed from here. And, you know, find my way back into what section of the back end code that I need to be in order to manipulate that data.
Gotcha. Nice.
So in this case, I'm not going to run this rabbit hole because I can tell you right now, it ended up being a false lead.
Oh, really?
So as it turns out, the best way, and this was again through a conversation with the mentor, because trying to change the logic on the front end to have it sort for the preferred source locales versus the original strings was starting to prove to be a little bit challenging. And so I reached out to my mentor to ask, how should I approach this? At which point, you know, we discussed it and decided that it was better to actually parse that information on the back end and to send up either the preferred list or just a standard list. And that way, you know, that processing can happen on the back end, because for some of these locales and entities, you know, there's quite a few strings to deal with, and it would be handled much more efficiently on a back end front or in the back end. So, but you can see here, I did already change my string for this particular rendering. If I was to reload it, it would change because I changed my settings. But you can see that I have this in German, just hello, how are you? And so this is displaying it in the German, as well as here is being displayed in German. Whereas these ones don't have translations yet for German, so they are then defaulted back to the English, so that they are in a situation where they just don't show if they don't have already been translated. So those are kind of the key ways that I find my way around. Utilizing the tools that VS Code gives me in regards to being able to hover over items to get information about them, check their definitions, check where they're referenced, you know, utilizing the tools that are there already for me.
Love it.
So if you want to, I'm going to give you back the screen so you can pop the next.
Right.
And then were there questions when we were going through that?
Yeah. Two questions. Yeah, I think one question I had, April, was, so I have worked, so my first job was in Django. I worked there for like 6 months. I've been working as a professional software engineer since the last few years. But to be perfectly honest, I didn't fully like process all the code you were skimming and looking at. And so I think I just want to say, like, it seems like you've learned like a lot about this code base and stuff. And how long did that process take you to really get up to speed to where you're very comfortable right now?
When I first started that particular issue, I had already been working in the code base on smaller issues for about 3 weeks.
Gotcha.
So I think I had done about 5 or 6 contributions of smaller scale prior to taking that one on. So there was still a lot that I didn't understand. And if I'm being honest, there's still a lot within that code base that I still don't fully understand, particularly within the Python sections and the Django, just because, again, they were brand new to me 6 months ago. So, yeah.
That's helpful. So if I'm hearing you right, you're saying like, so I was able to contribute this feature that helps people who are not like non-native English speakers or like not the language publish it. It's being used by like hundreds, if not thousands of people. And yet, like, I still don't even understand how the code base works. I just needed to kind of get my bearings enough to work.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's encouraging.
And like I say, it is. And like I say, one of the things that I had learned up to that point with previous issues was that reality that there is often something in the code that will replicate this. If I'm looking to create a ref, and maybe I've never done it before, so I search in the code for create ref. And now I can look at instances where somebody's already created a ref, and I can compare that to the documentation and the things that I'm finding on Google, and then apply it directly to the code base that I'm in. Like, okay, how does it apply within this code base? And so it's a very rare situation that I run into where I can't find something within the code through searching that at least gives me a place to start, an idea to jump off from.
Yeah. Nice. So Felipe asks at this point, like, how long did it take you to do this process to solve this whole issue?
This issue ended up being a 2-parter. Once I got through this section of it, we added the ability to, and I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but let me hop over there real quick. The second piece to that particular one was to handle this locales tab. So you can see here, there's 4 translations on this particular string. 3 of them are from preferred locales that I've marked in my settings, and then 1 is just from a general translation. So in this case, because we've set a preferred source locale, the very first string that's going to show is going to be English, and that's regardless of whether or not you have a definition in there or a translation in there yet or not. It'll just automatically put the English. Oh, sorry. In this case, it actually didn't put the English on that one because I refreshed, I think.
Sure. So you're saying this broke into, gotcha. So you're saying like this broke into several pieces.
Yeah.
And
so it took me just over a month, about 6 weeks total.
Nice, to do this first piece.
To do both pieces.
And do both pieces. So like, was it like 2 weeks on each?
Here we go. So now we can see here that the first one is in English. The next one is the 2 preferred locales. And then it does still show you the Arabic, even though we're in Arabic right now, because that's the only other additional. And you can see on the full-fledged application, that's what this is. And if I were logged in, if I had any preferred languages, they would be above that green line and show here.
That makes sense.
So we incorporated that count and the ability to sort, organize, and redisplay those translations in that order as part 2.
Yeah, can you kind of give us a sense? Can we go to the actual GitHub issue and say like, how much back and forth was there? Did you like do this all at once and submit it, or like, what sort of process was there to get to this final product?
Yeah, if Zoom would let me get to my bar, there we go.
Nice.
So this is my actual, so the code itself for part 1 wasn't super extensive. It was about 200 lines of code added and just under 100 deleted. And there were 64 messages back and forth. Nice. And many of those were, you know, me being new and not adding proper syntax and things like that. So like here I had a problem with so I would just list here saying, I'm having an issue getting this to work. So actually I talked to a few people at IESD about this one because I kept changing both the homepage and the default would change together. And I was like, no, I need them to be separate. How do I get that? And so I had missed a step. In my searching, I didn't see these JavaScript files. And then I think it was the way he described it, which is why he apologized for misleading, which he didn't have to, but either way.
That makes sense.
So yeah, so I would ask questions and then they would answer. And over 90% of our interactions were written between GitHub issues and chat sessions.
Gotcha.
So, but yeah, so that was the phase one. I'm trying to see, I think we opened up another, I'm not sure where the additional issue was filed.
Sure, for the second one, but this is where you started.
Yeah, but this is the one that I started. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. So, okay, so super neat. So if I'm hearing you, so one thing I have definitely been guilty of and still feel is that when I'm on a new project, I just like do not want to make changes or ask too many questions because I'll look stupid, like I don't know what I'm doing. But it sounds like there's actually a lot of communication, some mistakes, but everyone was like totally supportive of that.
Yeah, in fact, I wish I had it opened and I closed it. I wish I had shown. So so part two of this one was where I blew it in a pretty scary way.
Really? Oh no.
I was trying to rebase my code onto master, and somewhere along the line, I didn't get the merge conflicts dealt with properly. And then I tried redoing my work and doubled down on it. And all of a sudden my PR had an additional like 215 commits that weren't mine because they were coming off of master and they had been, it was a mess. I blew the rebase up big time.
Wow.
So we actually ended up, well, I didn't. The mentor actually ended up having to cherry pick out the commits that were mine that were actually the valuable, contributions of code and spread it and put it into a brand new PR. So yeah, that was awesome to do in public.
Because everything's public with Mozilla. Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely.
Like, oh yeah, hi, that's me being new here.
Yeah, and I want to be totally honest. So like I work with Git all day long in GitHub, but I'm actually not super familiar with rebasing, and I often avoid it because it's not quite in my like familiarity zone. So that sounds scary and tricky in a lot of ways. Yeah, but I love it that you were able to learn this in public, unfortunately, but with great mentorship.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I survived, right? It's all good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so how long did it take? It looks like Rodrigo had a question. At some point you mentioned that there was a need to manipulate data in the back end. Did you have to work on this too, or was it just assigned to a different developer? No, I actually did take that on. The original data was being sent up, and then it was being sorted and organized with a function and a component in the front end. And so when we were making this change, like I say, we decided that it was actually going to be easier for a number of reasons to go ahead and do it into the back end. And so we ended up serializing and then sorting and organizing all of the code within the back end. And so that the list that gets sent up just gets displayed. It no longer needs to be manipulated on the front end.
Got you. Nice. So that task, was that code written by someone else, or that you actually literally wrote that code?
I modified code that was already there.
Got you. And is that in this first issue, or?
You know what? That's a good question.
You could just look at the files.
A little bit of it is. A little bit of it is, and then we went back and we actually refactored that.
Got you. Could you maybe just show us with this code, like on like the changed files in this first commit, like just to kind of make it real for us, like so we can see the view, there's some logic in the controller, but like what does it actually mean to change the model in this particular database, code base?
So if I go to the files changed, and then, oops, here, jump to, we're gonna go to the models.py, because that's where that change was. So you can see this is where it started on line 336, which is where he pointed me. And then I needed to move it, as I said before, with Python, you can't use something until it's been declared. And so I had to move the code quite a bit further down into the code base because one of the aspects that I needed access to, and if I remember correctly, it was a long time. I actually can't even recall. There was something within here that I wasn't able to access. Oh, actually, I do know. It was this locale, the actual locale dot field or model. Sorry. And so I needed to place this below locale in order to get access to those objects.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I just want to add for people like that, this looks unfamiliar too. So when you said, like, for example, on the line where it says locale.objects.filter, you were just highlighting. Locale is a table in the actual database. And in this case, we're sort of representing it with a sort of a Python object locale that you can then do stuff with and set properties on or reference.
Correct, within Django. So Django allows you to go in and actually do database work within the code itself using Python code versus actually going into the SQL directly and doing queries.
Gotcha.
So this was this was the field that I added here. So it was just a char field, has a maximum length of 20, and then it can be true, or excuse me, it can be blank and it can be null.
Nice. Cool. Changing the database. Yes.
Yep.
Amazing. So if there's more, April, if you want to say something more, there's more questions, definitely throw them in the chat. What I wanted to do is move on to sort of our last few slides where I think the practical stuff is super helpful. But I think also as April and I were talking about this, we were sort of bonding over a lot of angst and struggle and triumphs in our very, very early careers, and kind of wanted to share some sort of tips or high-level thoughts about that. So I'm going to share my screen, April, and we can sort of jump into this. I think I'd love it if you went ahead and just kind of talked us through what we have on the slides and add whatever sort of comes to mind as well.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So let's send this here. So we covered these things, but I kind of wanted to stick on this idea that you were sort of sharing, April, and you can elaborate a little bit.
Oh, you wanted me to jump in? I thought you were gonna get started.
Oh, no. I mean, I can, but why not you do it? I think it's like this sort of came from you.
I think this last phrase here is something that has really held me over a lot of the time, which is that everything is figure outable. And it's a phrase that I heard from another kind of a motivational person called Marie Forleo. So I didn't coin it myself, but it's something that's really helped to keep me from kind of freaking out, to be honest. So if I find myself and I'm like, I don't even know like where I'm supposed to start with this, like what am I supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Where is this even at? I just kind of, I stop and I take a breath. I kind of allow myself that emotional freak out. And then I just take a breath and I just remember that everything is figure outable. Like, you know, a lot of people will tell you go out and check Google because you're not likely to be the first one to have that issue. And, you know, it's true. And where it can get really frustrating is that not everybody's had exactly the issue you've had because not everybody's in your code base. So they don't have access to how all the pieces are connecting. And it's sometimes hard to break it out into a question because there's so many bigger things that surround that little issue that you need to have reference to in order to answer that question. But at the end of the day, if you just stay persistent and kind of read through multiple different solutions within different texts, within different contexts, you can start to piece together the commonalities. And then with those commonalities, you can then start looking at, okay, how does that play with the code and the way my code's communicating? And then just kind of start playing with stuff. And, you know, it was a big concept and a big thing for me to learn, which is that it's okay to break the code when you're on your own branch. Because you can always revert, especially if you're doing good, you know, version control. Sure. And so kind of one of my work habits has become when I have things at a stable place, I commit. Because then I know that I can go in and I can break and I can do all kinds of stuff, trying things out based on what I know and what I've read and just kind of putting it all together. And then if I completely botch it and I get myself way into the weeds, I can just revert back to that last known spot that everything was functional at and try again. And I think that's just it was an important concept for me to get my head around, that it's okay to break it. And then, you know, try to fix it.
That is super freeing.
It really is. It really is. And you really start to pick up on the pattern that, you know, you get one little thing done, like, and you know, to bite it off into smaller chunks too, like to, you know, okay, I knew that I needed to display the title, you know, choose your preferred source. So let me just put that in place so that I have a placeholder that I know it's there and it's not exactly right, but it's there. And then I can worry about the bigger pieces and the details and build from that. You know, just. So
I just wanted, as you're talking, kind of look at the way you sort of made things bite-sized. So here are your commit messages. And I'm sure they're not perfect, but like you're definitely doing small stuff, right?
Yeah. So like that first one, added prefer source locale to settings.
Let's look at it. Yeah. What exactly was it? Let's see.
It was, just
CSS.
changing, the CSS. I added a div that put the locale onto the page.
That's
and that was it.
What? That's so tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was rendering.
Nice.
It was rendering. It was on the screen. I now had it in place. And so now I can, what's the next step? Where do I need to go from here?
Cool. And then you did your next one and next one. And how many commits were there? Let's see. There's 33 commits. 33. Yeah. Nice. Super decomposed. Cool. One thing I wanted to say, so I think one thing I always really appreciate about your story, April, is that like you had definitely had knowledge that you brought in, but a lot of what you learned was on the fly and you sort of jumped into open source. For those of us out here being like, this is really cool, it's definitely a little bit intimidating, but you're sort of making it more accessible. Can you actually just maybe share your screen and show us, like, if I want to fix a really simple bug on, say, Pontoon, like how do I start? And maybe you can share, like, show what the website is or something.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best websites to go to, in particular for Mozilla. And again, I do really advocate for them because one, it's just been a really great experience for me. But two, is that as a company and as a business, they're very, very supportive of contributions. And so they make it, accessible. So they have a site here called Code Tribute. And within that code, it breaks down Bugzilla, basically, because Bugzilla in and of itself is big. So let's say you are wanting to find something and your language of choice is JavaScript. So you can go ahead and search for items that are within the Mozilla's bugs list that are JavaScript based. And you want to look for these that say good first issues. So like this one here is upgrade to React hotkeys. If you open it up, you're going to see the issue itself. And, just kind of read through it and see what you see. And honestly, on those good first bugs, I'd be tempted to just say, if you think you have a general idea, just ask for it. Say, hey, can I help you on that? And then if you get stuck, you can ask questions. And if you get really, really stuck, you can just tell them, you know what, I'm gonna have to step out. And that's fine. They'll find somebody else. They'll put it back up, reopen it, somebody else will jump in. So any of these like that say good first bugs here on Code Tribute are fantastic. And you can also narrow it down if you wanted to just, let's say there's a product that you're really familiar with. So let's say Firefox desktop front end. I'd like to work on that because I'm pretty familiar with, I use it a lot. So here's one here. You're gonna remove an ellipse string function and use text overflow instead. So that one's probably going to be pretty straightforward. And if I'm not mistaken, more often than not, these first bugs will actually end up with what I had before, which they link you straight to the actual part of the text. I mean, that's
nice.
Right there. So this is probably going to take you really close to where you need to be, if not right on. So yeah, I really like the way that Mozilla does it, especially for new contributors. So you can see this issue's been around a while and it's had quite a bit of debate. Nice. So, but it, just by the description, it doesn't seem like it would be something that would be too overwhelming.
Cool. I love that. I think one thing I'm learning from you, I've yet to contribute to open source, but this idea that at Mozilla, they sort of let you come in and start with something simple. And as you're there, you'll kind of uncover the rest of the code base that's relevant to that.
Yeah. And I mean, I had the unique experience because I was doing outreachy. And so I specifically targeted one community. But I would recommend that one do that because that's how you're going to learn. You're going to learn the code base because you're going to do issue after issue after issue in the same code base. If you're jumping around from, Firefox desktop over to add-on containers, over to, Pontoon, like those are 3 separate code bases that are maintained by Mozilla. And so you don't get as in depth of a knowledge as you would if you were to just say for this month or, these 3 months or whatever, I'm just going to do, you know, a bunch of issues on Pontoon, and I'm going to start with a small one and build up from there.
For sure. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so Javier is asking, I'm very awful at saying I can't do it and giving up. I grew up with Goku, so imagine that. What, I don't actually know what that is. What is some advice for me? April.
I'm similar.
Nice.
I mean, it's that everything is figure outable part of me. Like, I'm pretty determined to figure it out, you know? Like, I think that's really, I would say it's going to come down to just your personal sanity level, and how much help you're getting, depending on which repo you're working in. If you're not getting much feedback from the people that you're, you know, remember when you're doing contributions, you're helping out. Not only are you helping yourself become a better coder because you're working in these code bases that are big and unfamiliar, but you're also helping them. You're taking something on so that they don't have to do it. And so even if it's small and minute, it's still helping them. So if they're not able or willing to help you when you get stuck, that's probably not a community that's a good fit for you. And that makes it a little easier to just say, sorry, I can't help you anymore. This isn't working for me. Thanks, but no thanks, and find somebody else.
Nice. That makes sense. So it sounds, so as I'm watching this talk, I already see you working on Pontoon, and you seem to have a great mentor. I know this is part of an internship, but like, let's say I want to contribute to Pontoon right now, and I like know JavaScript or Python. Like, can you just like leave us with a link to immediately start working on that right now?
Just immediately start working on Pontoon?
Yeah. Are there like, where do I look for that? Because that community sounds cool. How do I start with that, for example?
It is a cool community. Trying to remember.
Or we can also, yeah.
Oh, actually just going to their
Great, and then maybe you could just throw that link in the chat once you, yeah.
I will, yep. And they have at the bottom, which I'm still sharing my screen, so I'll show you, a really great README for making your first contribution. And I will link that as well. I really like this this project. In addition to, you know, the mentor just being really great to work with, super smart. It's just a real clean and well-structured code base. So it's one of the easier ones that I've found to be able to find my way around in, just because the don't be surprised if you submit something that you're going to get syntactic errors and nits, like, you know, please use single quotes instead of double quotes, or, you know, little things that seem trivial when you're, you know, putting your code in. But in the end, it makes the code so much easier to read because it's all structured very similarly and in ways that so that you can find those similarities within the code quicker.
Nice. Jason
Thanks,
also
Jason.
says, yeah, oh, that is huge.
Yeah, they're a great company. When and if they have openings, I'll share.
Amazing. Yeah, cool. So April, unless there's something else you want to touch on, or there's more questions, I might just wrap us up by going back to the slides and kind of reading our ending slides, summarizing what we said, and then everyone can hang up this Zoom meeting and go to Pontoon and start contributing right now, or just spam, totally
Don't
spam.
I was going to get him an army, damn it.
Yes, yeah, or just ask April if you need advice or stuff. That's amazing what her experience is like. I'm sure April, in my experience, April is amazing at sharing what she knows and stuff, and so she'll hook you into the knowledge. Great, so let me just share this last thing. So we'll talk about.
By the way, just real quick, I wanted to say to Marcel that I'm sorry I wasn't around 11 months ago too.
Oh yeah. Oops, oh, that's not how I share it. Okay, cool. So just to wrap up, April shared some really practical ways to jump into the code base thinking about where something exists within, or I guess this is me, about where it exists, whether it's the model database in the view, like HTML, or controller logic in between. We also just, both of us, I can say I as well, start with the UI, like an actual web page, and either just copy some hard-coded text or inspect the class names of divs to kind of go in there your search. Taking advantage of your IDEs, both being able to search text, but also being able to find definitions. So in VS Code, I think you said it was you right-click on it, April?
You right-click on,
Yeah, and then I think I use ID, like I think it's called IntelliJ. I use WebStorm. You hold down Command and you click on the thing and it goes to where it's defined. But definitely look that up if you don't already know. And then also just having a piece that, like, it's okay to break things, to just try small and start wherever it's needed. And I think, yeah, just ending with this big idea that everything is figure outable. Sometimes coding can be overwhelming. We're here to support you. You're here to support us. Mentors at Mozilla hopefully are there to support you. And yeah, I think so often in my career, and I'm sure people can relate to this, have felt just embarrassed by how little I know or how much I'm struggling, and overwhelmed by how much is going on. But I think that having been through that, sometimes still being there, but being a little bit on the other side of that, I know that when I see my past self struggling, or someone in a similar situation, I'm like, I've been there, I get you, and I want you to succeed. So I think just believing and knowing that people out there are thinking that can give all of us some courage to jump in. Yeah. Cool. So those are sort of the last words I had. If that's it, I think we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I just saw John, definitely. They've been coming out with some really neat tools too, some additions to their tools.
Oh, Firefox Dev Tools?
Yeah, I've been like super happy with some of the stuff that they've shipped lately.
Nice. Amazing. Yeah, it's definitely practically useful, very meta. Cool. Sweet. So I think I will, unless people want to hang out specifically, you can drop in the chat. I think I might I guess I haven't been to a Zoom meeting yet. Do we just sort of wrap up and end the call?
Pretty much, yeah. Great job, both of you guys.
Thank you.
It was enjoyable. If there's no other questions, as soon as you guys tell me, we can end the call. And the video will be generated, and I can provide you a link.
Great, for sure, yeah. And let's keep this conversation going. Feel free to direct message me or message me in a channel so we can all talk and
yeah, for sure.
Hear more about your thoughts and stuff.
If any questions come up after the fact, or if somebody rewatches it and thinks, "Wait a minute, like Slack it out there," I'll answer.
Awesome, cool. Well, I wish you all. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Lydia, for being here.
Yeah, especially Lydia.
Thank you. Bye, you guys.